Canada just officially divorced America. Not legally, not on paper, but in every way that actually matters. And the phone call that just happened between Ottawa and London, that's not just diplomacy. That's a signal to the world that everything we thought we knew about North American unity is over. Here's what just went down. Prime Minister Mark Carney picked up the phone on February 16th and called British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. But this wasn't a courtesy call. This wasn't the usual diplomatic pleasantries. What they discussed represents nothing less than a complete restructuring of Canada's place in the world order. Now, what I'm about to show you changes the whole picture of what's happening between Canada and the United States. The two leaders talked about something called the Defense Security and Resilience Bank. Sounds bureaucratic, right? But here's what it actually means. Canada is now spearheading the creation of an entirely new global financial institution owned by nation-states designed to fund the military build-ups of NATO countries and their allies, completely independent of Washington. We're talking about an institution that could have up to 40 member countries. We're talking about headquarters bids from Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, and Ottawa, with an estimated 3,500 high-paying jobs. We're talking about all 6 major Canadian banks now backing this project. And we're talking about Britain agreeing to work alongside Canada to make it happen. But here's where it gets complicated. This call came just 2 days after Starmer addressed the Munich Security Conference and made an announcement that caught everyone's attention. Britain is deploying its entire carrier strike group to the North Atlantic and Arctic this year. The HMS Prince of Wales, the Royal Navy's largest warship, leading F-35 jets and helicopters in something called Operation Fire Rest. And who's operating alongside them? Canada, the United States, and other NATO allies. But that's not even the real story. The real story is that Starmer specifically mentioned reflections from Munich during his call with Carney. He talked about the importance of what he called a more European NATO. He talked about the need for European allies to step up defense spending. And he talked about Canada not as America's neighbor, but as a partner in building something new. See, what most people don't understand is that this phone call is part of a pattern. Mark Carney has made 5 multi-day trips to Europe in less than 6 months since taking office. 5 trips. Compare that to his single brief visit to Washington. His very first trip as Prime Minister before he even called an election was to London and Paris, not to meet the American president. And what did Carney say during that famous speech at Davos last month? The speech that got a standing ovation from global leaders. He said, quote, "The old order is not coming back. We should not mourn it. Nostalgia is not a strategy." That wasn't just rhetoric. That was a declaration. Reports are now confirming that Canada and the UK discussed intensified collaboration on trade through something called the Canada-UK Economic and Trade Working Group. Digital trade, critical minerals, sovereign AI infrastructure. These aren't small agenda items. These are the building blocks of economic independence. And then there's this. They discussed ongoing negotiations between the European Union and the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. Why does that matter? Because Canada is actively trying to create a bridge between 2 of the largest trading blocs on Earth, forming what could become a coalition of nearly 1.5 billion people, all outside of American control. This is the part that kept me up last night. Starmer expressed condolences following the tragic shooting in Tumbler Ridge, British Columbia. That's standard protocol between allied nations. But what's not standard is everything else they discussed, because every single topic, every single initiative, every single partnership they talked about represents Canada building alternatives to its relationship with the United States. And then this happened just days before Carney's call with Starmer. Canada officially joined the European Union Security Action for Europe program. You've probably never heard of it. But you need to understand what this means. SAFE is a €150 billion loan program designed to speed up joint procurement of defense equipment across Europe. It was created to help EU member states invest in defense industrial production. And now Canada is in it, the first non-European country in history to participate. Let me say that again so it sinks in. Canada, a North American nation, joined a European defense program and became the only country outside of Europe ever admitted. Documents reveal that under this agreement, Canadian companies can now compete for up to 80% Canadian content in SAFE contracts. Canadian defense? Manufacturers suddenly have access to one of the largest defense markets in the world, and Canadian products can participate in European joint procurement projects focused on everything from ammunition to drones to missiles. The agreement was formally signed at the Munich Security Conference by Canada's Defence Minister, the same conference where Starmer announced Britain's Arctic deployment, the same conference where European leaders talked openly about building hard power independent of American guarantees. But wait, it gets more significant. Sources are now confirming that Canada only paid €10 million to join this program. That's a one-time fee for access to a €150 billion initiative. Meanwhile, reports indicate Britain was asked for significantly more in the billions. Canada got in at a fraction of the cost because they move fast and they move first. What we're learning is that this isn't just about defense contracts. This is about supply chains. This is about strategic independence. This is about Canada positioning itself as what one analyst called a central connector between North American and European defense structures. Think about what that means. Canada is now integrated into both NORAD and the new European Defence Framework. They're a member of both the Defence Production Sharing Agreement with the United States and the SAFE instrument with Europe. They're playing both sides. Or more accurately, they're building redundancy in case one side becomes unreliable. Here's what nobody's talking about. The Canada-EU summit last June produced something called a Security and Defence Partnership. That agreement laid the groundwork for everything happening now. It allowed Canada to participate in SAFE. It opened European procurement to Canadian manufacturers, and it signalled to the world that Ottawa was serious about looking beyond Washington. Since that summit, Carney has signed 12 trade and security agreements across 4 continents: Ecuador, Indonesia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, China. India is coming soon, Brazil, Mercosur, the ASEAN bloc. The list keeps growing, and every single one of these agreements has the same purpose: reducing Canada's dependence on its largest trading partner to the south. The latest information shows that over 75% of Canadian exports currently go to the United States. 75%. That's an extraordinary level of economic integration, and Carney has pledged to double non-US exports within 10 years. That's not a talking point. That's a transformation. Now, what does this mean for the Carney-Starmer call? It means that when these two leaders discussed defense cooperation and the DSR Bank, they weren't just making small talk. They were coordinating strategy. Britain is looking for ways to stay relevant as America's commitment to European security becomes uncertain. Canada is looking for partners who can help it survive economically if American tariffs become permanent. Officials are now saying that Canada views Britain as what Carney himself called a reliable partner. And that phrase, reliable, partner, is doing a lot of work because the implication is clear. Someone else is no longer considered reliable. The HMS Prince of Wales deployment to the Arctic isn't just about Russia. It's about showing that NATO's European members, plus Canada, can operate together in the High North. It's about demonstrating capability independent of American leadership. And it's about creating facts on the ground, or facts on the water, that will be very hard to reverse. This is where the story takes an unexpected turn. The Defense Security and Resilience Bank that Carney pitched to Starmer isn't some distant proposal. It's happening right now. The First Nations are already writing the charter. The headquarters location will be announced by the end of March, and by mid-2026, parliaments across NATO countries will be voting to approve it. Here's how it works. The DSR Bank will be a multilateral institution owned exclusively by nation-states. No private shareholders, no corporate control, just governments pooling their credit strength to finance defense and security projects at scale. The bank addresses three critical challenges that have been holding back Western rearmament. First, affordable capital for governments, delivering long-term, low-cost financing without adding pressure to national balance sheets. Second, smarter and faster procurement, helping governments streamline and finance defense acquisitions. Third, unlocking private capital by providing guarantees that enable commercial banks to fund defense and security firms across the entire supply chain. And then this happened. All six major Canadian banks have now announced their support for the DSR Bank. Royal Bank of Canada, TD, CIBC, Scotiabank, National Bank, every single one, plus major international banks, including JP Morgan, Deutsche Bank, ING, and Commerce Bank. The development group working on the bank includes former senior NATO officials, experienced global bankers who have managed billions in assets, and advisors from across Europe, North America, and the Indo-Pacific. One senior military advisor involved called it a response to a renewed realization that to prevent war, you have to prepare for war. Now wait, it gets more complicated. Canada isn't just supporting this bank. Canada is positioning itself to be the anchor nation. Multiple Canadian cities are competing fiercely to host the headquarters. Vancouver claims it's the only city in Canada that can conduct business across Indo-Pacific, European, and Arctic time zones in a single business day. Toronto points to its financial sector strength. Montreal highlights its international organization ecosystem, home to nearly 70 international organizations, including 6 United Nations offices. Ottawa emphasizes its proximity to government. Whoever wins gets an estimated 3,500 high-paying jobs in defense finance, international operations, and specialized research. They get regular international meetings of member nations. They get global visibility. And they get to be at the center of a new institution designed to finance the rearmament of the democratic world. Here's what I think most people are missing. The DSR Bank is designed to work alongside existing institutions, not replace them. But its creation represents a fundamental acknowledgement that current structures aren't adequate for what's coming. NATO allies have pledged to spend 5% of GDP on defense, 5%. That's an enormous increase from the 2% target that most countries struggled to meet. Canada has committed to reaching 2% this year and 5% by 2035. That's the largest military spending increase in Canadian history since World War II. And Carney has deliberately structured these investments to reduce reliance on American defense contractors. Reports are coming in that the DSR Bank could eventually include up to 40 member countries. That's a substantial portion of the democratic world unified around a single financial institution dedicated to defense procurement. The bank could provide the financing backbone for everything from submarines to cybersecurity to critical infrastructure resilience. The UK's participation is crucial. Britain has one of Europe's largest defence sectors, major manufacturers, and deep integration into European supply chains. British companies account for over a quarter of the continent's defence industrial base. When Carney and Starmer agreed to task their teams with advancing collaboration on the DSR Bank, they were essentially pledging to build this institution together. But this is the part that changes everything. The bank isn't just about money. Sources are now confirming that some nations have asked whether it could become a convening authority to bring together different countries, other multilateral institutions, and commercial banks to create new secure supply chains. Supply chains that aren't dependent on those nations presenting a threat today. In other words, supply chains that don't run through China or through America if America becomes unreliable. Let me tell you what this all means for the future of North American unity. Canada used to be the test case for deep integration with the United States. More than any other country, Canada showed that you could build your economy, your security, your entire national identity around partnership with America. Supply chains were seamless. Defense cooperation was automatic. Cultural ties were assumed to be permanent. That model is dying. What we're witnessing isn't just a policy shift, it's a strategic reorientation that will take a generation to fully understand. Canada has concluded that dependence on Washington is too risky, and if Canada, the most integrated, most proximate, most culturally similar American ally, has reached this conclusion, then no alliance should be considered safe from reassessment. The Carney-Starmer call crystallized everything that's been building for months. Two leaders of major NATO allies, both representing countries that have historically relied on American security guarantees, discussing how to build alternatives together, not as a rejection of America, but as insurance against American volatility. Here's what the latest information shows about Canada's strategy. First, diversify trade. 12 new agreements across 4 continents in 6 months. Ecuador, Indonesia, UAE, China, and counting. Talks ongoing with India, ASEAN, Mercosur, the Philippines, Thailand, Saudi Arabia. The goal is to cut America's share of Canadian exports from 75% to something sustainable. Second, build European ties. The Safe Defense Agreement, the DSR Bank Partnership, the Security and Defense Partnership signed last June. 5 trips to Europe in 6 months. Canada is embedding itself in European institutions in ways that would have seemed unthinkable just 2 years ago. Third, strengthen the military. Largest spending increase since World War II, 5% of GDP by 2035. New submarines potentially built in partnership with European manufacturers. Arctic infrastructure investments, all of it designed to ensure Canada defend itself and contribute to Allied defense without depending solely on American systems. Fourth, create new institutions. The DSR Bank represents Canada's ambition not just to participate in the existing order, but to shape what comes next. A new multilateral financial institution potentially headquartered in Canada, financing the rearmament of 40 democracies. Officials are now saying that this approach reflects what Finnish President Alexander Stubb called values-based realism. Canada will remain committed to sovereignty, human rights, and international law in principle. But Canada will be pragmatic about working with partners who don't share those values if it serves Canadian interests. The implications ripple outward. If Canada can reduce its US dependence, other countries will follow. Japan is watching. Australia is watching. Even European nations that have historically assumed American protection are reconsidering. The rules-based order that everyone talked about for decades has experienced what Carney called a rupture, not a transition. Starmer's announcement about deploying the carrier, Strike Group to the Arctic, fits this pattern perfectly. It's a demonstration that Britain, Canada, and other allies can project power together. It's a message to Russia about Arctic security, but it's also a message to Washington about European and Canadian capability. Where do I think this goes from here? The DSR Bank will be established by year's end. Canadian companies will start winning European defense contracts. Trade agreements with India and the Pacific will accelerate. And the conversation between Ottawa and London will become a template for how middle powers navigate an era where great power competition makes traditional alliances unreliable. Mark Carney said in Davos that nostalgia is not a strategy. He was right, and the phone call with Starmer proved he meant it. Canada is building a future that doesn't depend on any single partner, no matter how powerful, no matter how close, no matter how familiar. The question now isn't whether Canada's pivot will succeed. It's whether America even notices what it's losing until it's already gone. I'm curious what you think about this. Is Canada making the right call by hedging its bets?